Hello guys, welcome to a new chapter of the Empress Dowager Cixi. This is going to be chapter 28, Cixi's Revolution, 1902-1908. Cixi carried out her revolution over 7 momentous years, from her return to Beijing at the beginning of 1902 until her death in late 1908. Milestone changes define the era, during which China decidedly crossed the threshold of modernity. Modernization enabled the country's annual revenue to more than double in this period, from just over 100 million taels to 235 million. And as revenues grew, so it became possible to fund further rounds of modernization. The reforms in these years were radical, progressive and humane, designed to improve people's lives and to eradicate medieval savagery. Under her measured stewardship, Chinese society was fundamentally transformed, thoughtfully and bloodlessly, for the better, while its roots were carefully preserved and suffered minimum trauma. One of Cixi's first revolutionary decrees, proclaimed on February 1, 1902, was to lift the ban on Han-Manchu intermarriage, a ban as old as the Qing dynasty itself. In a family-oriented society, the ban had meant that there was little social intercourse between the two ethnic groups. Even if officials were close colleagues, their families hardly ever met. The American physician Mrs. Hatlan described one occasion when 2 Manchu princesses and the granddaughter of a Han Grand Councilor encountered each other in their house. For a while, getting them to converse was like trying to mix oil and water. Now, the Han Manchu segregation was to be dismantled. The same decree required the Han Chinese to abandon the tradition of foot binding, stressing that the practice harms creatures and violates nature's intentions. An argument that appealed to a deeply held belief: respect nature's creation. Aware of the tenacity of the custom that had been in place for 1,000 years, and anticipating resistance that could lead to violent collisions, Cixi approached the implementation of her injunction with characteristic caution. She bid grassroots leaders make all households aware of her message and use example and persuasion to convince the families, explicitly and empathetically forbidding the use of brutal coercion. Cixi's style was not to force through drastic change, but to bring it about gradually through perseverance. When her American friend Sarah Conger asked her if her edict would make an immediate effect in the empire, she replied, "No. The Chinese move slowly. Our customs are so fixed that it takes much time to change them." Cixi was prepared to wait though. Her emphasis on gradual change contributed to the fact that many young girls, including this author's grandmother, still had their feet broken a decade later, but they were the last generation to undergo this suffering. Again, using persuasion and promotion rather than force, Cixi began to release women from their homes and from male-female segregation, breaking a fundamental Confucian tradition. Women started to appear in public and to go to theaters and cinemas, enjoying undreamed-of pleasures. She particularly espoused modern education for women, repeatedly urging viceroys, high officials and aristocrats to lead the way and set up and fund girls' schools. She herself set an example by personally founding a school for aristocratic women, to which she appointed her adopted daughter, the imperial princess, as headmistress. Another of her plans was to open an institute of higher education for women, and as an incentive for applicants, it was announced that each graduate would have the honor of being referred to as a personal pupil of the Empress Dowager. In 1905, a female sponsor of a girls' school, Madame Huixin, used self-immolation, a traditional and not uncommon way to draw attention to a cause, to appeal for regular funding for her school. The flourishing press of the time made her a national heroine. Men and women gathered for her memorial services, and a Peking opera was written to tell her story. Cixi gave her full support by publicly stating that a star-studded cast to perform that opera in the Summer Palace. She also chose another new play to be performed on the same occasion. Women Can Be Patriots, aimed at awakening women's political consciousness. In spring 1907, a regulation for women's education was decreed, which made it official that women should receive education. A champion in education was Viceroy Duan Fang, who had impressed Cixi with his reformist ideas and his ability during her exile in Xi'an, where he had been the acting governor. Elevated to key post in the Yangtze Valley, this new political star was responsible for many modernizing projects, including China's first nursery school. It was he who dispatched the country's first female students abroad in 1905. They went first to Japan to study teacher training and then to America. Among the teenage girls who were awarded government scholarships for Wasteland College in Macon, Georgia, was one Song Qianling, later Madame Sun Yat-sen, and later still honorary president of Communist China. With her was her younger sister Mei Ling, then a child who later graduated from Wellesley College in Massachusetts and became Madame Chiang Kai-shek, First Lady of Nationalist China. Many prominent women in the future benefited from the opportunities created by Cixi. One was the first female editor of a major paper, the Ta Kung Po, in 1904, in which capacity she attracted teams of adoring young men. Educated women launched some 30 journals to promote women's liberation, and one, Women's Daily, was apparently the only women's daily in the world at the time, even though the paper itself did not last long. In the first decade of the 20th century, the expression women's rights, Nu Kuang, was in vogue in China. An influential booklet proclaimed as early as 1903, the 20th century will be the era of revolution for women's rights. In a civilization that had treated women with unparalleled cruelty, their emancipation had begun. Another key component of Chinese society, the traditional educational system through which the empire's ruling elite had been selected, was finally scrapped. This hindrance to modernization and to Chinese thought as a whole had been on Cixi's agenda for some years, and during that time she had gradually established an alternative educational system, and alternative routes to a career in government as well as in private sectors. So when the final push came in 1905, this giant pillar in China's political infrastructure for well over 1,000 years collapsed with extraordinary ease. The new educational system was based on Western models with a whole range of subjects introduced, although Chinese classics remain on the curriculum. That year, after visiting one of the new schools with English-speaking teachers and uniformed pupils in European-style classrooms, library and athletic rooms, Sarah Conger pondered in amazement. What will be the future of China when these hundreds and hundreds of educated young people go out from these schools as a leaven into its vast population? 3 years later, the number of such schools, not all of them so well equipped perhaps, was in the 5 figures. Young people studying abroad received either scholarships or incentives such as the promise of desirable jobs when they returned with satisfactory qualifications. At the beginning, many were reluctant to go, especially the sons of elite families, who found life without troops of servants unimaginable. But anyone who aspired to be an official was told to go, to travel if not to study, and in 1903 being abroad for at least several months was made a mandatory qualification for future posts. An edict from Cixi was also ordered by existing officials to travel abroad, which she said was something that had only advantages and no drawbacks. The number of students studying overseas soared. In Japan alone, in the early years of the century, they were estimated around 10,000 students. With new education and new thinking, young Han Chinese began to question and reject the Manchu rule, and their publications were full of outcries in this vein. The Manchus are foreigners who invaded China and have dominated us Hans for 260 years. They conquered us by slaughtering and brought us disasters for which we had to pay the price. They forced us to wear pigtails and make us a laughingstock in London and Tokyo. After the list of grievances came the inevitable battle cry, drive out the Manchus, China for the Han Chinese. In 1903, a devastatingly anti-Manchu essay, The Revolutionary Army, by one Su Rong, appeared in a newspaper in Shanghai. Calling Cixi a whore, the essay vehemently advocated the overthrow of the Manchu government. Expel all Manchus who live in China or kill them for revenge, it cried. Not at least slay the Manchu emperor. The essay infuriated the Manchu grandees, including the most open-minded reformers and Cixi herself. By the Qing legal code, these incidents amounted to high treason, punishable by some gruesome form of death. Even the dedicated reformist Viceroy Duafang, who was a Manchu, wanted the author extradited from Shanghai. and punished with life imprisonment, if not death. Shanghai turned down the request for extradition, and Su was tried in situ by a largely Western panel, with the Chinese government represented by a lawyer. Judged against a Western law to do with sedition by word and not by deed, in mid-1904, the author was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and hard labor in a Western-style jail. The newspaper was banned. This cause célèbre was a lesson to all. Extremist writers felt the need to tone down their language. The prison in Shanghai, though not a hellhole like most in China, was far from pleasant, and Su, in poor health and unable to sleep, died within a year. For Cixi, the case provided much food for thought. She was faced with a new challenge: how to deal with hitherto unthinkable expressions akin to blasphemy in the rapidly expanding press. To treat them as treason and to deal with them by the old laws would be to turn back the clock, and she rejected the option. She refused to listen to those who advised suppression or recommended stopping sending students abroad, where they learn all manner of heresy. She chose instead to regulate the press with laws and regulations based on Western and Japanese models, and these were gradually introduced. As a result, the new century witnessed an explosion of Chinese-language newspapers and journals. Hundreds of titles sprang up in more than 60 locations around the empire. Anyone could start a newspaper if they had the funds, and no one could silence them. General Yuan, as the Viceroy of Sili, based in Tianjin, was mercilessly assailed by the most influential newspaper there, the Ta Kung Pao, and as much as he hated it, he was unable to shut it up. All he could do was order government employees not to buy the paper and the post office not to deliver it. Both measures being unsuccessful and only served to increase the paper circulation. Cixi's tolerance of attacks on her government and on herself, as well as her willingness to permit diversity of viewpoints, were unmatched by any of her predecessors, or arguably her successors as well. Along with the introduction of unimagined freedoms, Cixi began to revolutionize China's legal system. In May 1902, she decreed a wholesale review of all existing laws with reference to the law of other nations, to ensure that Chinese laws are compatible with those of foreign countries. With a legal reform team headed by a remarkable mind, Shen Jiabeng, who had a comprehensive knowledge of traditional laws and had studied several different Western codes, a brand new legal structure based on Western models was created in the course of the decade, covering a whole range of commercial, civil, and criminal laws as well as judicial procedures. Cixi approved the team's recommendations and personally decreed many landmark changes. On April 24, 1905, the notorious death by 1,000 cuts was abolished, with a somewhat defensive explanation from Cixi that this horrific form of execution had not been a Manchu practice in the first place. In a separate decree, torture during interrogation was prohibited. Up to that point, it was universally regarded as indispensable to obtain confessions. Now, it was deemed only permissible to be used on those whom there was enough evidence to convict and sentence to death, but who would still not admit guilt. Cixi made a point of expressing her loathing for those who had a penchant for torture and warned that they would be severely punished if they failed to observe the new constraints. Prisons and detention centers were to be run humanely. The abuse of inmates would not be tolerated, law schools were to be set up in the capital and provinces, and law studies were to be made a part of general education. Under her, a legal framework began to be constructed. In a less obviously groundbreaking development, commerce was made respectable. Although paradoxically the Chinese love making money, the culture traditionally held commerce in distaste and ranked it at the bottom of the professions, the order of prestige being scholar officials, peasantry, craftsmen, and lastly, merchants. In 1903, for the first time in its history, China had a Ministry of Commerce. A series of imperial decrees offered precisely defined inducements for aspiring entrepreneurs to form companies whose registration local governments were told to grant instantly without a moment of delay. One such incentive ran: those who raise 50 million yuan worth of shares are to be appointed first-grade advisor to the ministry, with first-grade official status, and be awarded the Special Imperial Double Dragon Gold Medal, with their male descendants inheriting a third-grade advisory post in the ministry for 3 generations. Further incentives were given for merchants to attend expositions abroad and to identify new products for export. The many other developments included the establishment of the State Bank in 1905, followed by the birth of a national currency, with the yuan as the unit. The system is still in use today. The Great North-South Artery, the Beijing-Wuhan Railway, was completed in 1906. An embryo network of railways was in place. The Army and Navy acquired new HQs to grand European-style, turn-of-the-century edifices with oriental features. Designed by a Chinese architect, they were among the most interesting buildings in Beijing. It is said that Cixi footed the bill herself. Perhaps she was atoning for having taken money from the Navy in the past. As the Chinese were adopting a whole range of new ways to live, the old habit of opium smoking finally started to decline. Half a century had gone by since the country was forced to legalize the drug, and a large part of the population, officially estimated at nearly 30 or 40%, was taking some opium. A stereotypical image of the Chinese in the West was filthy and contemptible faces in foul opium dens, a most unfair portrayal considering the origin of their addiction. Chinese, anxious about the state of their country, had been tirelessly advocating a ban, and so had Western missionaries. Foreign opium imported into China was chiefly produced in British India and shipped solely from British ports. Public opinion on both sides of the globe was overwhelmingly in favor of prohibiting the trade. In mid-1906, the British Parliament debated the issue, and the mood of the country so excited the Chinese minister in London that he wrote home at once. If we show we are serious about prohibition, I am certain Britain will be deeply sympathetic and will act in collaboration with us. Seizing this opportunity, Cixi announced her intention to eradicate opium production and consumption in China within 10 years. In the decree, she expressed her revulsion towards the drug and described the damage she was doing to the population. A detailed 10-point plan was drawn up to enable all people in the empire under the age of 60 to kick the habit. Those over 60 were deemed to lack the physical strength needed for this strenuous process. The effect of the condemnation, observed H.B. Morse, who was in China at the time, was electrical. Farmers stopped cultivation with little resistance. Smokers abandoned the habit by millions, and it became unfashionable to smoke in public, and the young were constrained not to acquire the habit. Many millions continued, of course, to smoke, but a generation of Chinese is growing up, of whom few have acquired this habit. A request was put to Britain to bring the opium trade to an end, and the British government readily responded. In line with Cixi's 10-year program, it agreed to restrict opium export from India by 1/10 each year. Both Britain and China regarded this as a great moral movement, and each willingly bore a considerable loss of revenue. At the end of 10 years, the eradication of opium smoking and production in China had made astounding progress, and the British export of opium had come to a complete stop. Great changes chased after one another like ocean waves. Chinese who did not live in the treaty ports enjoyed many a first in their lives. The first street lighting, first running water, first telephone, and first colleagues of Western medicine, to one of which Cixi donated 10,000 taels. First sporting event, first museums, first cinemas, first zoos and public parks, and the first government experimental farm. Many read their newspapers and magazines, and a pleasurable habit of reading the daily paper was being formed. Cixi experienced quite a few firsts herself. One day in 1903, she asked Louisa Pearson whether her daughters knew how to take photographs, as it would cause a storm to allow a male photographer into the palace. Louisa Pearson informed Cixi that one of her sons, Shun Leng, had studied photography while abroad and had brought back good equipment from Europe, and perhaps he could take pictures of Her Majesty. Although a man, Shun Leng was Louisa's son and could be treated as family. He became the only photographer ever to take pictures of Cixi. Later, the Dutch-American painter Hubert Bow claimed to have photographed Cixi in addition to painting her, a claim that is generally assumed to be true. In fact, there is no record of any kind to support this vaguely told story, nor does it seem likely given that he was an adult man and a foreign man at that. Even Robert Hart, who had served the Empress Dowager for decades, only had a few formal meetings with her, the longest of which in 1902 lasted 20 minutes. It was a memorable occasion and Hart recorded it. The old lady talked in a sweet feminine voice and was very complimentary. I said there were others quite ready to take my place, but she rejoined that it was myself she wanted. Among other things, she referred to the coronation of King Edward VII and said she hoped His Majesty will enjoy all happiness. Apropos of railway travelling, she said, with a laugh, that she began to think she would enjoy even a foreign tour. Given her love of travelling and her intense curiosity, Cixi would have liked nothing better than a foreign tour, but she never seriously contemplated the idea, as she judged it unfeasible. Similarly, even though she was the supreme ruler of the empire, she never set foot in the front section of the Forbidden City, or entered the palace through its front gates. She would not challenge such enormously controversial conventions for the sake of gratifying her own desires. Although she must have wished to mix freely with men and would not have minded at all having a foreign man paint her or photograph her, Cixi would have resisted doing so. Her restraint and her discrimination were key qualities that enabled her to change the empire as well as rule it. Her judgment as to what should be changed and when and how it should be done was crucial to the fact that there was little upheaval throughout her revolution. When Xunling came to take Cixi's photographs, he had to do so on his knees at first. Everyone was obliged to kneel when they engaged the Empress Dowager's attention, but in this position he was unable to reach the camera on its tripod. Liang Ying, the head eunuch, brought him a stool to kneel on, but he could not balance himself while handling the camera. Cixi said, "All right, exempt him from kneeling while he takes the photographs." Cixi, now in her late 60s, looked at her age in the photographs. These realistic pictures would have made her frown, so before they were presented to her they were touched up, which was not uncommon in those days. Her face was airbrushed, with the wrinkles erased and puffy bags under her eyes smoothed away. Many years were a sponge, leaving the images of a beautiful woman in her bloom. This facelift is unmistakable when comparing the prints of Xunling's own collection, now in the Ferrier Gallery in Washington, D.C., which were not worked on, with the prints of the same photographs in the Forbidden City archives. These touched-up images were not what her mirrors had been telling her for quite some time. Cixi was thrilled when she saw them, and there followed a frenzy of photo-taking. She posed in various postures, in one putting a flower in her hair like a coquettish young girl. She changed clothes, jewels and surroundings, and had complicated sets constructed, as if it was a stage. She had long wanted to act in an opera, and courtiers had spotted her singing and dancing in the palace grounds when she thought she was alone. Now she dressed up as Guan Ying, the goddess of mercy, had court ladies and eunuchs clothed in the costumes of the characters associated with the goddess, and posed with them on the set. Her favorite pictures were then enlarged to as big as 75 by 60 centimeters, tastefully colored and framed, and mounted on the walls of her palace. So excited was Cixi by her own younger and prettier looks. Some large framed prints were later presented to foreign heads of state, who had written to congratulate her on her 70th birthday in 1904. These were delivered to delegations with considerable solemnity. American newspapers commented, "The pictures give her the appearance of 40 years instead of 70. The touching up, enlargement and framing of the pictures were done by the oldest and best known photographic studio in Beijing, owned by one Ren Yingfeng, who had studied photography in Japan. Ren was soon invited to the court, where he was put in touch with the great Peking opera actor Tan Xinpei, a member of the court's music department. The actor's biggest fan was the Empress Dowager, who not only rewarded him handsomely, but also enabled him to command huge fees when he performed outside the court. Now Tang was directed by Ren in China's first film, The Jingun Mountain, showing an episode in a Peking opera of the same name. This was 1905, and Cixi could reasonably be credited as China's first movie executive producer. The film was shot in spite of an earlier accident. The British had given Cixi a projector and some silent movies for her birthday the year before. After 3 reels in the first screening, the motor had exploded. Cixi does not seem to have taken to films. Their appeal to her was limited as there was no soundtrack, which meant no music. Both Ren and others went on to make other films and cinemas, showing their work as well as foreign films, including short detective stories, blossoming and percolating into their vast interior of cinemas. The news that Cixi had photographs taken with eunuchs in stage costume, at a time when no woman could appear on stage and to be playful with eunuchs was considered improper, soon became known to her enemies, who seized upon it in an attempt to damage her reputation. From late 1904 to the end of 1905, Shi Bao, a newspaper set up by Wild Fox Kang, with his right-hand man Liang as the main contributor writing from Japan, carried daily advertisements offering photographs of Cixi for sale. The advertisements, in the name of the paper's sister publishing house owned by a Japanese, Takano Bunjiro, highlighted the fact that she was dressed up in theatrical costume and sitting side by side with her two favorite eunuchs, one being Liang Ying. This was calculated to arouse public disgust. In addition, the prints were being offered at exceedingly low prices and were marked as discount goods so as to maximize the insult. Cixi did nothing about the advertisements or the publishing house, which had an office in Beijing, a stone's throw from the Forbidden City as well as in Shanghai. Rather, she turned the table on her enemies by giving a photo of herself with Liang Ying as a present to a Japanese diplomat. The impact of the advertisement seems to have been non-existent. Cixi was enjoying considerable popularity. Pearl Buck, the Nobel laureate for literature, was then living in China among peasants and other ordinary people, and she observed that they loved her. For her 70th birthday, Cixi had decreed that there would be no celebrations, but many still celebrated. In Beijing, outside the Tiananmen Gate, numerous lanterns of different colors and shapes illuminated the whole area, attracting crowds of spectators and revelers. In Shanghai, Sarah Conger wrote, "In driving through the streets in the foreign concession of Shanghai, we saw many beautiful decorations in honor of Her Majesty's birthday. The Chinese scores were aglow with brilliant colors. Even the Chinese flag was waving, a most unusual thing as the flag in China is used only officially. I never saw such a departure from old customs. Myriads of beautiful lanterns in their almost endless varieties added brilliancy to the many other decorations. The Chinaman proclaimed his loyalty to China and her rulers in such a way that the foreigners could understand that loyalty. For all the dramatic reforms sweeping across China, Cixi introduced very few at court. Rules did relax for the eunuchs, who were allowed to visit bars and theaters outside the palace, but the medieval practice of keeping eunuchs remained, and so consequently did the castration of boys for this purpose. There was a moment when Cixi considered abolishing eunuch keeping, but the eunuchs reacted with a campaign of whipping to get her to change her mind, and she suspended the move. On the whole, the court stuck to the old rules, with rigid etiquette and formality, prescribed costumes for different occasions remaining sacrosanct. Arriving at a gathered court, Cixi would, with a glance, take in all the details of the clothes being worn and would address any errors. In her presence, people continued to stand, if not kneel. On the only occasion when she dined with the ladies of the diplomatic corps, she and the foreign diners were seated while the Chinese princesses stood. As the banquet proceeded, Sarah Conger asked if the princesses might not be seated too. Cixi felt obliged to turn to them and with a wave of her hand tell them to sit. This was the only time any Chinese, except the emperor, sat down to eat with her, but they did not really eat, an eyewitness observed. They sat down in a timid, rather uncomfortable way on the edge of the chair, but did not presume to touch any of the food. During the dinner, China's minister to Britain interpreted for her on his knees. Cixi was especially strict about officials observing etiquette. Every time she traveled between her palaces, designated officials had to kneel at the arrival and departure points to greet her or see her off, even in the rain. One day, the rainwater dripping from a kneeling figure was bright red and green, and it turned out that the official was too poor to own a real formal robe for the occasion and had to wear a painted paper one. On another occasion, after she had bestowed gifts on a large number of officials, they gathered and waited to thank her by going down on their knees. Because of their numbers, they had to perform the ritual in the courtyard where it was raining hard. They waited for more than an hour while Cixi watched the rain from behind a curtain. When the rain subsided, she ordered the ritual to proceed, during which the officials knelt on the wet ground, spattered with mud. The obligation to kneel was a nuisance for everyone. Grandees found it unbearable if the audiences were protected. Eunuchs had knee pads permanently sewn into their trouser legs, as they had to drop to their knees whenever she addressed them, at all places, whether it was on stone floors or rocks. Arthritis of the knees was a common problem for eunuchs. Cixi understood that it was painful to kneel and would usually curtail the time people had to do so. Once, for the benefit of Catherine Karl, some court painters were summoned to draw chrysanthemums in the fields. As the Empress Dowager was watching, the painters had to kneel while drawing. Their discomfiture was visible to Cixi, and she told them to pluck some flowers and go and paint at home. For one reception she gave, the Foreign Office official presenting the diplomats, Wu Tingfang, was supposed to kneel. This would have put him in an embarrassing position, as the foreign diplomats he presented would be standing. He would look like a dwarf next to foreigners, he complained to Louisa Pearson. On her advice, Cixi exempted him. In that case, he doesn't have to kneel. Wu was then posted as China's minister to Washington and led a life of heady freedom, acquiring a reputation as the man who enjoyed making blandly insolent remarks at dinner parties. Upon returning to Beijing, he interpreted for Alice Roosevelt, daughter of President Roosevelt, when she visited China in 1905 and had an audience with Cixi. Having got used to the American way of treating himself as an equal to anyone, Wu seems to have forgotten that he had to be on his knees to Cixi or ask beforehand for permission not to kneel. He stood and chatted quite at ease. Alice wrote, "He stood between us a little to the side, but suddenly as the conversation was going on, the Empress said something in a small savage voice, whereat he turned quite grey and got down on all fours, his forehead touching the ground. The Empress will speak. He will lift his head and say it in English to me. Back will go his forehead to the ground. While I spoke, up would come his head again while the Empress was speaking in Chinese. Then back to the ground again. One literally had the feeling that she might at any moment say off with his head, and that off the head will go. This was in fact the time when Wu was co-heading the empire's legal reforms and enjoying Cixi's esteem. In those years, with her blessing, even rather conservative governors banned kneeling as part of the etiquette in their provinces, but Cixi retained it in the court. At stake for her was the godlike sacredness of the throne, which was the one thing that gave the throne its hold over the vast empire. Kneeling was the manifestation and reinforcement of that sacredness, without which the throne and the empire might falter. To hold on to this symbol of total submission in an increasingly enlightened empire, Cixi sacrificed her curiosity and never rode in a car. She had been presented with one by General Yuan, who had stepped into Earl Lee's shoes in more ways than one. Not only had he inherited the Earl's jobs and role as a close advisor to the Empress Dowager, but, like the Earl, he was quite a talented gift-giver. The car he brought for her was lacquered in imperial yellow, with a dragon motif and a throne-like seat within. Cixi longed for a ride, particularly as she had just had fun riding a tricycle, also a present from the general. But with a car there was an unsurmountable problem. It was impossible for the chauffeur to operate the wheel while kneeling or even standing. The chauffeur would have to sit down right in front of her. The car remained the only modern device that was interesting and available to the Empress, which she did not try.